It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. My CEO guest today is Diane Batayeh. Diane is the CEO of Village Green Holding and directly responsible for the oversight of all of Village Green Holdings' operating companies. She plays an integral role in the development and implementation of the Village Green Holdings business plans and strategic initiatives. After nearly 4 decades at Village Green, starting as a part-time sales consultant, in 2011, Diane became the Chief Operating Officer and a board member of Village Green Holding. In 2014, she was promoted to President and COO of Village Green, and in 2017, promoted to Chief Executive Officer. Diane Batayeh, welcome into the corner office.
Thank you, Brant, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Oh, it's great to have you here, and I'm so looking forward to talking about you. It's rare that you see someone who starts as a part-time sales consultant and ends up as CEO, and this is going to be an incredible journey. But let's start with your early years. I understand, if I'm not mistaken, you grew up in Detroit. Tell us a little bit about the early years there and what your early family life was like.
Well, that's an interesting story. It dates back actually to the fact that my parents were immigrants that came from the Middle East. My father immigrated from Jordan about 60 plus years ago and came to the land of opportunity. He came without my mother. They were a year into their marriage. He parked her at his mother's home where he had hoped she would learn how to cook. And she was at the time giving birth to her very first child, my oldest sister, Jeanette.
Wow.
He came to America along with 2 of his relatives in tow, and then they began searching for work, and he wanted to establish himself before sending for my mother about a year later. And so I grew up in a working class family of immigrants, a stay-at-home mother. I think she was the CEO of the family. She essentially ran things. Ultimately, she bore 7 children.
Oh, my goodness.
And my father is a longtime auto worker at Ford Motor Company, 40 years there in the city of Detroit. Learned a lot of things from that, which we'll probably get into a little bit later.
Sure.
But my mother raised 7 children.
My goodness.
There were 6 girls and 1 boy. Wait for it. We grew up in a 900 square foot home in Southwest Detroit with 1 bathroom. Now, picture that. 6 girls with 1 bathroom.
Wow. Was the boy the youngest?
He absolutely is. Every single time my mother was pregnant, I'll never forget it. My relatives all gathered round kind of in hopes of having that golden child son.
Oh, my goodness.
As you might imagine, in an immigrant family, having a son to carry on the name was extremely important. So every time he would have a daughter, everybody would sort of lament, Yaweli Abraham. And what that means is poor Abby. Right?
Oh, I love
so
it.
Imagine, sort of how that made us girls feel growing up, like second-class citizens. When my brother was finally born, they went back to the Middle East. When he was a year old, they did not cut his hair until they went back to the Middle East. They went to church, had his first haircut, and gave the church money. And that was their way of thanking the Lord for finally having born a son.
Wow.
So that was sort of the backdrop of our upbringing in that neighborhood. Now, that's not to say it wasn't a very loving, close-knit family relationship, but the girls sort of had their place, and the boys obviously had their place.
Very traditional Middle Eastern culture.
Very traditional. My parents' marriage was actually an arranged marriage, believe it or not.
Oh, gosh, I do.
So ultimately, there's a lot more in between there with that story, Brant, but I think that'll give you a sense, high level of how I grew up and what my family life was like.
Well, I cut my teeth in the Middle East as a first-time executive for the Procter & Gamble company, believe it or not, and worked all throughout that region and was exposed to many aspects of that culture and the food, of course, which is fantastic. Yes. But that is a wonderful story. So literally, your younger brother grew up with 9 mothers.
Yes. He joked that he grew up in PMS boot camp, Brant.
Oh, my goodness.
And he
Poor
happens
guy.
to be a stand-up comic by trade now. Yes, and he actually uses a lot of his growing up as fodder for his stand-up routines.
I can imagine.
Right.
Now, where are you in the pecking order? Somewhere in the middle? Or
I am number 3 from the top.
Okay.
And for many years, I was the middle child. But regardless, I took on that role of Kissinger in the family because all of my family members, my siblings all sort of paired up, and I was odd man out, and I sort of naturally gravitated to the role of mediator. And I think that set me up well, for my future career.
I would say.
Well,
what were some of those lessons from the early years, particularly from mom and dad, or maybe older sisters or younger sister and brother?
Listen, how to dodge flying objects.
Particularly the 900 square foot space.
Yeah, that was one of my early sibling lessons. My father had an extremely strong work ethic. He was extremely loyal to the company.
Now, did he find the job when he came to Detroit, or did family members?
He had a little bit of a journey there. He started out working at a sort of a corner store, if you will, and I think that merchant background coming from the Middle East, he actually was part of a agricultural family there, worked on the farm, was not educated. He probably had 6 years of schooling and worked on the farm for his father. So when he came here, there was another relative who had a corner store, and my father began there and tried to become rather entrepreneurial. That I would say that wasn't within his skill set. He was more of I would say, a loyal worker bee, if you will. And nothing, not intended to detract whatsoever. I think he was just set up well for being the sort of person that would join a company and very rules oriented. So he adapted well. By the time he started working at Ford, it was more of following where other relatives had gone and found success.
Sure. Was this the post-war period then, 45, 50s? Yeah, right. So they were hiring, right? I mean, it was probably boom times. Yeah.
Right around 1952, plus or minus, which was absolutely, the golden era of the auto companies.
Sure.
So when he came in, he worked on the line, and he kind of worked his way up to a foreman position, and that was where he stayed. So he taught me, just through observing him, that loyalty to the company. When, God forbid, we should buy anything but a Ford. And that was absolutely, I learned from that when you find a company and you take care of that company and they take care of you, that was a natural state for my father. And so he also conveniently worked the afternoon shift. So he was gone when we came home from school. And my mother did all the heavy lifting with child rearing.
Did you see him in the evening once you got tucked in for bed? Yeah,
we did. Although my father, I would say, again, that traditional role of the dad, the breadwinner, coming home and not necessarily being that connected to the children. Although I'm not saying he didn't show us love in his way.
Sure.
Mom was really the person, much, much different. Yeah. My mother was she was a stay-at-home mother, but her workload was immense with that many children.
Gosh, I can imagine.
So she taught us the strength of family, the bonds. She was very self-sacrificing and took care of everyone, including other relatives that followed them. She was very well liked. She had a great, engaging, approachable personality. So I learned that just through observing my mother and her ability to help people solve problems, and her putting herself second was something that I watched and learned from, and I think is ingrained in me today in terms of my leadership style.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Well, just to build a little bit on that loyalty lesson from your dad, I know you've spent almost your entire career, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, at Village Green. Not too dissimilarly, I spent my first corporate jobs were 10 years each with two great companies, Procter & Gamble and Disney. But my son worked at Ford straight out of school. And I drive a Mustang with the employee discount, which is nice. But he had a wonderful 5-6 years there, decided to go off into the startup world. But, I counsel so many kids of the executives I work with because they say, Brant, they won't speak to me. Talk to them about their career. And I give them that lesson. I tell them, go work for a large company, get a chance to spend several years there. Don't be a job hopper because there's a lot to be learned, even if your pay may not keep up with the standards that, your cohorts might have in school. There's a lot to be learned, providing that loyalty and getting the type of training and education with great companies like Ford.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, terrific. So tell us about your student years. I mean, you obviously went to school locally. Were you a good student there? Did you, your kids were probably all just 1 year apart. So you probably had many of the same teachers your older sisters had as well.
We did. And I think, as is probably true in most large families, every child has their shtick.
Right.
I'll call it. So there's the one who's sort of the troublemaker. There's the one who's the one getting all the attention, and there's the talented one in music or dance and what have you. I was the studious, scholarly sibling. Okay. I always excelled in school, and I didn't really look for many accolades. In fact, I was always very embarrassed about the attention that I got making sort of the National Honor Society, and school was a comfort zone for me. Thank you. Right. And so one of my sisters, actually the one just younger than me, wasn't quite as, I would say, skilled, or maybe it was an attention issue for her, but she was in one of my classes with me, a humanities course where there was sort of a mixed grades. And I can recall her sitting next to me and trying to steal my answers off my paper. And I would cover it up. And she got mad at me because she thought I allowed the cute boy on my other side to sneak a peek, but not her. That wasn't necessarily true. That was sort of my role. And I had great relationships with the teachers. I will tell you, one of the things that I remember very distinctly is I didn't feel in my comfort zone with similarly aged people. I always gravitated to the older people. Yeah. And so that
maturity levels probably, was that what attracted you, or hard to know at the time?
In the moment, I didn't connect the dots. But as I look back, I do think it was that I might have matured a little bit more rapidly. And that, again, could be a product of my home life and the role that I played there. But I always kind of was ready for the next thing. So that was a very fun memory for me, is that I really enjoyed school. And ultimately, when I went on to higher learning, that was something that came naturally to me.
What about outside of class? Sports, music, theater? Were there other interests that you pursued, Diane?
Well, let me say I always got picked last in dodgeball, so that should give you a sense of my athletic abilities.
Okay.
I did actually play softball, again, just for fun. It wasn't as though I was on a team or what have you, but I enjoyed team sports. It wasn't something that I would say I was passionate about. I was, however, part of the band in school, flute player.
Good. Which instrument?
The flute.
The flute, okay.
Yes. One of my very early mentors and inspirations was my band instructor, Mr. Rowley. He, I would say, he was probably the first person, I think, that influenced the trajectory of my life outside of being inner city. And
what were some of the inspirations he gave you, or messages that you remember from those days?
Get comfortable being uncomfortable. That is a lesson that I take to this day, and I share with young people in our company on how to be successful, is to just get outside your comfort zone. I can recall I was accepted at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I applied for school, and I took, the SATs, because that's what everyone else was doing, right? You just had that peer pressure to do that. And although I had really no inspiration from my family to go on to higher learning.
Yeah, it wasn't really a foregone conclusion you'd go to college,
not.
Right? Yeah, right.
Their idea of success, Brant, was to find a husband with great health insurance. So once again, not to take away from, the influences of my parents, which was great, and I carry to this day.
They're very traditional.
That career did not come into the kind of mix for a female.
Yeah.
And so Mr. Rowley, I'll never forget, I was talking to him about sort of lamenting over what should I do? And he just looked at me very directly and he said, if you are thinking of doing anything other than accepting your acceptance into this highly accredited university and getting the heck out of Detroit and making something of yourself beyond what you can do here, you're an idiot, right? So he essentially pushed me. That was an uncomfortable conversation I had with my parents. And when they dropped me off at college, I'll never forget, one of the gentlemen in our dorm was kind of casually walking by going, hey, party in the dorm tonight. And I'll never forget my father's look. I am not leaving you here. Get back in the car. So that was interesting. But going back, other things that I did extracurricularly, which I'll share, is that I was very into politics. I was part of youth in government. I worked on a local campaign, and I ultimately thought I would be in politics someday. That was something that really attracted me.
Yeah. What attracted you to that? Again, was it a coach or a teacher, or was it something you kind of pursued on your own? So that sounds interesting. Let's find out about that.
It was a class in school, and it was something that appealed to me, and I found myself really getting more interested outside the classroom and trying to absorb or digest any information I could get. So I would read, I would ask a lot of questions. I actually went down into, I'll never forget, the campaign for Ken Cockrell for city council. And a friend of mine happened to be working on the campaign, and that sort of, I think, also teased my interest. And just understanding the difference you could make in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And the neighborhood that I grew up in was very underprivileged at the time. It wasn't as bad as it is today. So I saw the need, and I saw the fact that one person, could make a difference. And so when I began sort of venturing into those waters and seeing that you can make a difference, and to sit back and complain and have an opinion on those who are in, public service, I don't feel you have a right to if you're not going to actively engage and try to make a difference. So that was an interest of mine early on, kind of late in my teen years, and to this day, I still have that interest.
Awesome. Any entrepreneurial things, or any part-time work? I know probably culturally that wouldn't have sat quite well with your parents. But did you pursue things?
Brand.
Oh, as I said, I had 4 years cutting my teeth in the Middle East, so I know. Made my own mistakes out there.
And it's funny because they brought that culture with them. So it was not.
Sure.
They didn't come to the United States and assimilate. They came and they brought it with them.
It's usually a generation or two before that happens, right?
I would agree with that. And I'm going to answer your question by telling you this. If you've ever read the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, okay, you understand the concept of financial literacy and independence. And that wasn't something that was necessarily condoned. So to become an entrepreneur was very risky. So that was never something that was ever approved of or encouraged, but instead looked to with somewhat of disdain, I would say, that was too much of a risk and that you were being irresponsible, right? So that was sort of the backdrop.
Yeah.
And I obviously don't agree with that now, but in my early years and that sort of influence, I didn't understand that then, what I understand now. It definitely influenced my need for security. However, I did work as obviously in school in the summer internships at a local bank as a part-time teller. And so I did get some experience, and through schooling, that was acceptable, right? If I was doing it as part of school, it wasn't necessarily
frowned upon. John decided.
Correct.
Well,
that's exactly right.
Going to school and given, the traditional nature of the Middle Eastern culture, and despite Dad hearing about the party that Friday night, there was expense involved. So did you go on scholarship? Did you have those internships pay your way? How did you kind of cover those expenses? Because I can imagine being the third one down the pecking order and 6 more to go, that was a hard thing for perhaps Mom and Dad to help out with.
It was a combination of scholarships, grants, and I also worked while I was going through college. And I worked in food service, which is pretty common for starving college students. And I, basically survived off ramen noodles and peanuts and crackers, peanut butter and crackers, which I didn't mind at all.
Sure.
I think it was a good way to do it. However, having worked my way through, it was a balance. It was difficult, but I felt as though I had accomplished something, and I didn't take it for granted.
Well, I was going to say that's probably the biggest point, right? You were paying for it yourself and earning through it, and you take every class seriously. How did you decide what to study, and what was that field of study?
My undergraduate studies were political science and economics. And obviously my interest in politics, I thought my career path would be become a lawyer and then into public service. That was my plan. And that's sort of what undergraduate studies were centered on pre-law. What did I need?
So that's back to the high school experience in public service. Yeah, interesting.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. Huh. And so that's how I did.
But you didn't go down that road.
Well, ultimately I didn't, but that's an interesting story because that will give you an idea of how I landed at Village Green very early on in my life, relatively speaking. I had planned to go to law school, and I was accepted at Davis School of Law in California.
Wow. Yeah.
And that very same
year.
It's
a very good law school.
Yes. I was looking forward to that. And I actually a year prior had met someone who ultimately became my fiance at the time, who I ultimately did not marry, but that's a story for another podcast, Brian.
Right.
Very colorful story. So I'll spare you the details on that.
It wasn't an arranged marriage, I take it.
Not at all. No. And frankly, my father was very disappointed in all of his daughters, who not one of us married a Middle Eastern person. Not one. However, his granddaughter has married a Middle Eastern young man, so it's skipped generations. So I think, that's a good story. What I decided to do ultimately was defer acceptance. We were planning to get married, and then I would venture off and go on a deferred acceptance. So what ultimately happened was within that very same year, I landed the job at Village Green, which I'll tell you that story in a moment.
Yeah.
He dumped me. I got a Dear John letter, and I think it was a little bit of fate coming in into play here. So I got the job. I then ended up taking a different course because I was very set on continuing my education and taking a path toward public service at some point. So I went on to get my master's degree in public administration.
So you did that anyway. Yeah.
I did, and I did not get my law degree while working. I ultimately, in retrospect, I'm rather glad I didn't do that because I might be practicing law and I'm not doing what I'm doing today.
Right. So Village Green was your first job out of college, pretty much.
Well, I was in college at the time, my last year.
Of course. Okay.
How that happened, I was working as a waitress at the Ramshorn, the midnight shift. And I'll never forget this. I was 2 weeks into the job. My fiance at the time came in, and I was taking orders and in the kitchen. I apparently wrote down the egg order incorrectly. And the chef, they like to be called chef, even though they're short order cooks.
Of course.
At the Ramshorn, was very irate and was yelling at me because I couldn't quite figure out how to write it down correctly. So if you can picture saloon doors in the old Western movies, well, there comes Ed, my fiance at the time, bursting through, and he literally punches the guy for yelling at me.
The chef.
And disrespecting me. Yes. Well, I would tell you that if you can imagine, who do you think is more valuable to the restaurant, myself or the chef? So that was the end of my career, the short job. The following morning, I'm looking through the want ads back in the day where you actually had want ads. And I saw an ad for a part-time leasing agent. And I thought, I wonder what that is.
Right.
So I made a call and I interviewed for 20 minutes. And I was offered the job on the phone. No background check, no drug screening. Oh, yes. And the address to which I was to show up the following morning was the very building in which I lived, Brant.
And report. Oh, you're kidding. Really?
I am not kidding you.
Oh, my gosh.
So
that's wild.
I showed up.
You showed up at the property manager's office, right?
That's right. And the next, that's sort of the beginning of my career trajectory at Village Green.
Awesome. Did you have some leadership responsibilities early on, or did you work as a leasing consultant for a number of years and kind of did that more as an independent contributor?
Within a year's time, I was offered a promotion to in management at another property.
Fantastic.
And it was an assistant role, so I didn't really have direct reporting until the following year when I ultimately was promoted to the manager of that property. And that was sort of my first experience in a leadership role. And I would say I was still very wet behind the ears.
How old were you at the time?
Was 23 at the
20s.
time.
Yeah, fantastic.
Right. Boy, did I learn some valuable lessons.
They threw you right in the pool. So you were full-time by then, right?
I was.
And what were some of the, earliest lessons you learned from bosses and mentors, good or bad? And you don't need to mention any names of the bad ones, but sometimes it's that observation, right? That gets you some of the more important learnings.
Things that stick with you on what not to do. I remember the gentleman who happened to be the regional manager and was responsible for multiple properties and happened to be at the property. I was unaware of the fact that he was at the top of the stairs in the leasing office, and he was basically spying on those who were in the office, and I was taking a tour, and I'll never forget, he came barreling down the stairs and started yelling at me because I gave it wrong information, and the prospect was standing there. And so it was absolutely mortifying, and I thought to myself, well, I don't want to ever make someone feel that way.
Right.
So I later, he took me aside and he talked to me further about it. And I just thought to myself, well, that would have been good to do it that way rather than barreling down the stairs. So that taught me empathy, and that taught me patience, and sometimes let people make mistakes and use them as teachable moments. And I
Praise
think we
in public,
do
criticize in private.
Absolutely right.
Yeah,
and that having had that experience that very early on, I knew I never wanted to make someone else feel that way. A very good lesson that I learned was actually an employee, one of the first employees I oversaw, and he happened to be a mentor. He was the service manager at the property that I was given the reins on. Happened to be
obviously older than you, probably, right?
Yes, he was. He was in his early 60s.
Oh, my goodness. And you're in your 20s. I love it.
I absolutely am. And so here I am, wet behind the ears, property manager in charge, sort of like not completely well prepared, and thinking I had to know more than I knew, and basically just issuing commands because I had the pressure of my boss saying, you have to get such and such completed. So the lesson I learned from Al, it was a tough lesson. So he was responsible for the service crew. Right. And I can recall service requests stacking up. And
now this would be like maintenance, right? Is that
correct?
The way to think about it?
It's maintenance, absolutely. Yeah. They were stacking up on my desk, irate residents, and they had gone on strike, more or less. Wow. And I called Al into my office, and I thought, Al, what's going on? Help a sister out, right? Just having the conversation of what's going on here. And he just very calmly said to me, do you happen to know how long it takes to change out a garbage disposal? And I said, no. Do you know how long it takes to fix a leaky faucet and change a washer? No. And then he looked at me and he said, then how can you tell us what to do and how long it takes to do it? Come with me. So he took me for the rest of the day, and I basically shadowed him.
You shadowed him. Good for you.
And that was very, very impactful. Yeah. And from then on, we were partners, and it taught me empathy. It taught me be in the shoes, it's sort of a day in the life.
That's right. Yeah.
And really understand what they're doing to be able to lead them. You may not be that expert. I will never be an expert at fixing garbage disposals, but I will at least
you know how much time it takes to do it. Well, and that's an important part, right? It's managing expectations of your customer. That's one of the best rules in customer service, right? Because you can have customers that are unreasonable, and there's always a range. And if you don't know the range of time to get something done, how can you manage their expectations? Wow, what a valuable
That's exactly
lesson.
right.
Yeah.
It was.
Fantastic. So, gosh, at that stage, did you ever think you'd become CEO of this company?
Whoever thinks that's going to happen to them when they're 23, that was not even in my, bucket list. That was the last thing I ever expected at that point in my career. And quite frankly, even later, that wasn't something that I necessarily aspired to.
Right. Were the founders involved at that stage? Were they still around, or had
Gen
the company?
2.
Yeah. Okay. Gen 2.
The company has a very rich history. It's 100 years old this year. And it started by 2 Russian immigrants.
Oh, really? Wow.
And it actually began as a single-family home builder that evolved into multifamily in the 1960s. By the time I came in, Gen 2 was running the company, and Gen 3 was just entering the business.
Nice.
So I entered sort of more or less within a year's time of Generation 3 coming in.
Gen 3 coming in, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I love the name. Had they been called Village Green from the beginning?
Yes, the multifamily division was called Village Green from the beginning. However, the single-family business was called Holtzman and Silverman.
Okay.
And that was obviously the name of the founding fathers.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. I love how, having read about the company background, how that's evolved from being kind of, I guess we would call in California, the garden communities, right, into now what's become a sustainable message with Village Green, and how your name really has become not only relevant to both of those concepts, but evolved over time. You were in solar back in the 70s and 80s, which is incredible, thinking how, long ago that was, and, that being a real fledgling technology at the time. So it sounds like the company's really been a leader in many ways, hasn't it?
It's always been centered on, staying ahead of innovations and evolution of that industry in general. So we've taken our lessons from outside of the apartment industry and brought it in. Obviously, sustainability, Village Green, it's in our name. So it absolutely is part of what we stand for and who we are. And so when we were an owner-operator and developing properties for our own portfolio, we absolutely had more influence on what it was we created. Right. Today, we're a pure third-party operator as Village Green Service Company, and we do have owners coming to the table and engaging with us to help them with evolutionary practices on their buildings. So wherever we can influence it, we are using recycled materials and sustainable materials, and obviously energy efficiency is key. Protecting our environment is one of, is part of the ethos of the company.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Awesome. And so over the years, your career progressed. I would say it sounds like originally or initially through property and operations management. When did you make that transition into the C-suite, Diane?
Well, there's a little bit of a story ahead of that. When from the management aspect of the business, I actually evolved into the development and construction side in the late 80s, and was the person that was sent out to Denver to begin kind of our efforts in that market, building and acquiring and redeveloping assets. So I went from the operations side into the development side, finance, market research, and I did a stint as a project superintendent on one of our projects that we built. And so I had a lot of experience in between my operations life and then through the development and finance, and ultimately became the chief investment officer in the early 2000s. In 2016, I was then promoted to CEO when the final family member was bought out, and the company currently is owned 100% by Compatriot Capital, which is a subsidiary of Salmons out of Dallas. Right. And it was at that point in time when the final family member moved out that I moved into the CEO spot from the CIO spot.
Got it. So would you say in those early years when you went out to Denver and worked on development and had the finance and market research, were you being groomed? Did you feel that there was a higher power or executive power in place kind of developing you, or was it just kind of a combination of, getting the right experiences and being in the right place at the right time?
I think it was that. I think it was organic. I don't think there was ever a concerted effort on the part of my boss or anyone for that matter. And circumstances evolved and opportunities opened up. And I did skip a step here, Brant, which was in 2011. I actually, by that point, was the chief investment officer. When Compatriot came in to replace the final the partners that Jonathan Holtzman had prior to Compatriot, we had a COO at the time who abruptly left the company. And at that point, I don't believe if that was a pivotal moment.
Yeah, you stepped into that role.
If that did not occur, I was asked to step into the COO role. And by that point, I was very happy on the investment side of the business. So I was offered that, and I honestly had to think about it, right? I asked for a couple of weeks, and I chatted with my family and asked, what do you think? Because obviously it meant a much more global role and much more responsibility. So at that point, I was the only other C-suite member. So it was a natural, offer to me. The choice was, Diane, you step into this more global role, or we're going to go recruit from the outside.
Wow.
I had to think about that. What did I want to do? Could I see myself accepting someone else coming into the company rather than me stepping into the role? And I honestly saw it as an opportunity to influence the culture, which by that time had shifted somewhat from Gen 2 to Gen 3. And so my sister, there was a point in time when 4 of my sisters also worked for the company.
Oh, my
I failed
goodness.
to tell you that
Really?
part.
Oh, wow.
Yes. We considered changing the name of the company from Holtzman and Silverman to Batayeh Holtzman and Silverman, but that did not go over well.
I love it.
It did not get approved. So she said to me, Diane, you should think about why this is happening. Maybe this is your opportunity, to shift the culture and to influence and to make a difference. And so that was a light bulb moment. And I absolutely said yes at that moment, knowing that there would be some heavy lifting involved.
Yeah. And of course, once you stepped into that COO role, then perhaps becoming the CEO became a little bit more of luck than actually divine intervention and timing. Right.
It was, yes.
Fantastic. Well, you touched on culture, and I wanted to talk about that. What are your thoughts on really building a company culture? Or tell us a little bit about that shifting that went on, because boy, you probably have seen some changes, the G2 to G3, and now with the corporate ownership, right? Yeah.
At the time, it was a mentality of assets first, people second, service second, even though there was absolutely, Village Green has always been the gold standard when it came to apartments and apartment services. However, the internal culture was very much about assets come first at all cost. And the churning and burning of employees wasn't something that was necessarily focused on. Everybody worked extremely hard. There was an imbalance of sort of your quality of life on a personal front, and then where sort of the commitment to company. So while we were all very proud of what we were creating, there was a very difficult environment in terms of expectations, and the mentality of people first didn't exist.
Wow.
So, but be that as it may, it was a very successful company.
Yeah.
So
but
me,
probably a lot of turn, though, right?
It was not sustainable. You have it dead on. That's exactly right. And so there were quite a few talented people that didn't stick around for very long. So my opportunity really was to take a look at sort of the hedgehog concept. I know you've probably read Jim Collins. And I thought, what is it that drives our economic engine? What are we really good at, and what differentiates us that would enable us to build a sustainable business? And so after collaborating with some other top leaders, because I believe very strongly that you cannot have a myopic view of the company, and there's no way of really understanding the potential without having others weigh in that obviously have a different perspective and different roles. And so we spent a lot of time analyzing and exploring sort of what is that is that hedgehog concept, and what is that thing that really we ought to be focusing the business model on to build a sustainable company. Mm-hmm. So it came down to, we flipped the switch from asset driven to service driven. And so how do you create a great service-oriented company that's sort of creating homes, which is a necessity? That's a recession-resistant business. And how do you differentiate the company? And so if you have extremely talented people, you can then deliver great results, which then drive great customers and great fees. And that money can be reinvested into the company to continue to attract great talent. So if we have great talent, which we do, that is sort of proliferating this great service company and mentality and environment and differentiating us to, enable us to become this boutique operator that's got a very high profit margin as compared to our peers. So that is really, the culture shift was all around, how do we attract and retain great talent? How do we give them a voice? How do they become engaged? This was a lengthy, probably 2-year-long process.
Oh, I can imagine.
From start to finish. Yeah. And we started with a 3-paragraph long mission statement, and we changed that to what it is today, which is to deliver authentic experiences in the moment that lead to stories people want to share. And that says it all.
Yeah. I love it. Well, that's setting me up for my next question, because, with that cultural shift, it really does have an impact, not just on retention, but also on the people you bring in. So, what do you look for when you're making bets on the people you invest in, Diane?
We hire for character. It is very easy to teach people skills. Now, with the exception of technical positions in construction and in, the facility side of the business, we just look for passion and drive. And I'll tell you, some of our best hires on the marketing and sales side came from other industries, such as having a great server at a fine restaurant or a concierge at a hotel. So that is really what we focus on, is the character, the integrity, the work ethic, and the ability to be approachable and comfortable in your skin. So that's something that's really difficult to hire for by looking at a resume. We have great success through referrals. So some of our top talent, they generally refer their friends and family, and we find that to be a really successful model. That's what we focus on, Brant, and then we train everything else. We have a very robust in-house learning management program. It's called Village Green University, and we have undergraduate and graduate level learning, and then we have mentorships. It is an ongoing learning environment at Village Green, and we encourage it from within and externally. So I think that's really what we do to drive attracting that great talent. And we actually look in untraditional ways for people where we can grab talent. So, for example, trade schools, military veterans. Some of our most successful people are sports athletes that have come in from, as well as the military. So those are just a few examples. We're actually going into high schools and trying to attract people at that level.
I'm so pleased to hear you say that. So often at my executive recruiting practice, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, so often the companies will say, Brent, we'd love to work with you, but you don't have any experience in our industry. And I'm saying, well, I can find the best people in your industry. You want someone that can look at parallel industries, because the talent and the culture and the passion you have may not be, the best placed inside your industry. And I'm just so glad. And that really does make sense to me. And I can understand why you get so many good people to have that mind open to the folks that, I call it kind of the portable DNA, right? That are going to be able to bring things to your company that perhaps people that have worked in the industry for 40 years may or may not have. And, that's an important part of a recruiting strategy so often for companies that really want to grow. Fantastic.
It's actually a great way to evolve a company as well, to bring, outside thinking into the mix. And we've seen great success. I brought in a woman who is heading up our people services division now. Believe it or not, she came from a law firm.
There you go.
Why did I hire her? Because she had experience taking that company to become a great place to work.
Right.
And that's what I wanted to focus on here.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, Diane, you've been so gracious with your time, and it has flown by. This has been such a fun interview. But we always ask one last question, and that really is kind of what career and life advice would you give to someone who maybe has their eyes on a corner office, maybe not over the long term, but maybe sees kind of the C-suite opportunity as something that they aspire to, or maybe they're at that point in their career where they have a sister that says, hey, how do you want to influence things moving forward? What would you say to that person?
I think that what I think about is the Zorro circle, right? I think you should perfect what's within your job description today. Keep your head down and be the best at what you're doing today, and have faith that that will be noticed. And then you'll continue to have opportunities to expand upon that and have more influence. And then you absolutely will be noticed for results. That's the key. Get results. Also go after that extra 1%, right? Your job description might be X. Go one step further. Take the opportunities to do more than what's expected of you, because again, that will be noticed. And that's the story of my career, is to take what I'm asked to do and then make it that much better and sort of create your own lane that way. The other thing I would say is, professional presence is so important. Right. And while everybody's human and there are emotions involved, patience is critical. You may think you're ready for something, but you may not be, right? And others may know more than you know about your readiness. And so have that trust and faith. However, I will say, speak up for yourself. And there could be times when you're in an environment where your successes won't necessarily be noticed and rewarded. And being able to distinguish between that, versus just having some patience, that's somewhat of a skill. And you do need to stand up for yourself and make it known what your career path goals might be. Yeah. And if someone says, well, you're not quite ready, ask the question, what more do I need to do, right?
Yeah.
Don't just sort of be a passive participant in your career. Lastly, I would say, you've probably heard this before, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you speak. Take every opportunity you have for learning. And it may not seem relevant in the moment, but at some point in the future, you will think back on that and say, wow, I'm really glad that I asked more questions, that I listened to what they had to say. So trust and faith and patience are all very key ingredients, but the most important one is do the very best you can do in the moment and continue on. That will be noticed and ultimately rewarded.
Wonderful words of wisdom. Diane Batayeh, thank you so much, Chief Executive Officer of Village Green Holding, for sharing your story into the corner office today.
Truly my pleasure, Brant.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.